First National Bank, and Alaska Commercial. And now on to the show. So there's a free muffin at the next break for anybody who can guess the author of this ode, which begins like this. Now, Fran Ulmer is to politics what butter is to toast, ice cream to homemade apple pie, or gravy to a roast. Any guesses?
Governor Hammond.
Got it. All right. So that is Governor Jay Hammond, who hired a young Wisconsin lawyer in 1975 as a legislative assistant just a couple years after her arrival in Alaska. And Hammond was so impressed, he quickly made Fran head of his policy shop and helped launch her extensive political and civic career. Fran went on to serve as Juneau mayor, as a state representative, and in 1984, she won the open primary for lieutenant governor, joining up with Tony Knowles for the 2 terms they served as Alaska's top officials. And that's where I got to know Fran well when I was an aide to Governor Knowles. She was a trusted advisor on the 3rd floor who could work magic with the legislature and was willing to tackle tough issues from subsistence and the urban-rural divide to the perennial Alaska issue of development versus conservation. Fran went on to many other roles, but I think most importantly is her current international leadership on climate change, especially in the Arctic. And rather than talk at us, Fran is going to talk with us with the help of another board member, UAF History and Arctic Studies Professor Phil Wight. Phil's interests complement Fran's as an environmental historian and expert on Alaska energy. So please help me welcome Fran and Phil.
Morning.
You guys hear me?
Well, thank you for that very warm introduction, David, and congratulations again. I'm thrilled to be up here with somebody with the depth of experience of Fran. And Fran, you know, you have had the privilege of traveling all throughout this great state and to beautiful communities like Cordova many times. But I wonder what it's like for you to be back in a place like this, back in Cordova.
Well, it's true. Every time I get to a community that I have visited, experienced things, met people, and had sometimes really challenging moments, when I'm here, like in Cordova, they all come flooding back. Yesterday, some of us went on a walking tour with Ashley. And that red building that she described as the former museum, well, that also used to be where the city council met years and years ago. 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I was in the legislature, and the legislature created a special committee to look at what happened and what the recovery would be like, and how communities could rebuild. Well, we held hearings all over the place, including in Cordova. And I remember to this day, standing in that room. The room was filled with people, standing room only. Their faces were red, anger, fear, uncertainty. It was emotionally charged. And I felt that energy just standing in front of that red building, because people had no idea what was going to happen. Their livelihoods, were in the toilet. They didn't know if they'd ever be able to fish again. The subsistence community didn't feel as though they could safely harvest. I mean, so yes, when I go to a place like Cordova or many other places, those memories come back vividly. And of course, that has also had some interesting positive effects in a way. The Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trust Fund helped fund the building that we're sitting in right now. So it's interesting how things play out over time. But Yeah, mention any community and I'll tell you a story about how it sort of fit together in the long journey of how Alaska has changed and how it's been impacted in some cases by choices that people made and in some cases by things that they had no control over, and those were both good and bad sometimes.
Absolutely. Well, thinking about those major changes that we've seen in the state, that you've witnessed in the state, I mean, you have been so intimately involved in politics, policy, public administration. You've seen a lot of changes over that time. So what are a few of the major changes that has happened during your years in the state that have shaped the state today?
Well, how much time do we have? I would just have to say, you know, before coming here, I did not write a speech because David wanted us to have a conversation, which is great. But I did think about the kind of decadal changes that I've had the opportunity to experience and in some cases work on. And so I'll just briefly talk about the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, and hit a couple of the things that I think you really would have to say helped shape the way in which Alaska looks today and functions today. The 1970s, wow, that was a powerful decade in terms of innovation, in terms of decisions about how government will be structured. The first legislative session that I worked as a young lawyer working for the legislature in 1973 was the special oil and gas session of 1973. That put in place the severance tax, the production tax, basically the fundamental way in which Alaska would govern and tax the oil industry, which was coming. The Pipeline Right-of-Way Act had just been approved, and so the construction was beginning. So, you know, the oil taxes. Then, of course, in 1976, the people of the state adopted the Permanent Fund Constitutional Amendment. Big deal. I mean, huge, which we'll probably talk about more in depth a little bit later, the contribution of that decision by people. But I mean, I could go on and on about the pieces of legislation that were adopted and then funded once oil started flowing in 1977. Just a few. Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, ADA, the Alaska Energy Authority, the Municipal Bond Bank, the Alaska Renewable Resources Corporation. And then there were decisions like the Valley Hooch School Settlement, which put in place construction of rural high schools all across Alaska. The big D2 lands dispute, some of you may remember in Fairbanks, President Carter was hung in effigy because people were so upset about the D2 lands and what the federal government was going to do with 100 million acres that had been more or less set aside for conservation and federal protection way back under the ANCSA legislation. Land disposals. Representative Mike, I think his last name, who set in motion a whole bunch of land disposals. And so a whole lot of little pieces of land that the state let private individuals get, which then had to be serviced with public facilities. Alaska Coastal Management was created, a system of local government, state government, and federal agencies having to work together to make development decisions and regulation. But this is all the 1970s. You know, I mean, hang on to your hat. It was a whirlwind of decisions and changes, and then of course the 1980s hit, and there was so much money coming into the state. I mean, I know it's hard to believe this, but legislators would just get a pile of money that they could decide what they wanted to do with, more or less, in the capital budget. And, you know, they talk to local constituents and get a building built just like that. I mean, it's a very different time. But that also meant that there was the incentive to invest in renewable possibilities for the future. So the Delta Barley Project, all that agricultural development that some people thought would be a big piece of the economy in the future. Hatcheries, fish hatcheries, because of the concern that, you know, fishing goes up and down with natural stocks. And the idea was build fish hatcheries, nonprofits. There's one right here, Prince William Sound Aquaculture Association. Lots of state money went into making those happen to try to benefit the fishing industry. But it wasn't just money. I mean, it was also policy. So the 1980s, we did away with the income tax. We created the permanent fund dividend program after Alaska Inc., Governor Hammond's first idea about how to share some of the oil revenues with people got thrown out by the US Supreme Court because that was based on length of residency. And I could go on. All kinds of social programs in the 1980s. One of the first in the nation daycare assistance programs. State money to fill the gap between what it costs to actually have a quality childcare program and what parents can afford to pay. Daycare assistance program, domestic violence shelters, the Council on Domestic Violence, on and on in a whole variety of ways. The 1980s was huge. And then, of course, we had this big building boom because we had a lot of construction that was going to build up the infrastructure that Project 80s and other things put together and shoved money into the economy. And then guess what happened? Oil prices went down and we had a big bust. Remember? I mean, in Anchorage, there were houses and condominiums selling for half the value that they had sold for 2 years earlier. That was the late 1980s. Big bust. And then, as I said before, 1989, the Exxon Valdez. And guess what? Even though many families were devastated by that and the environment was damaged beyond repair, it seemed, a boom came from that. Because even though some people lost money, other people made money. Exxon spent a lot of money, the federal spent a lot of money doing cleanup. And so we had spillionaires. Remember that term? Spillionaires, vessels of opportunity. People could rent out their boat to clean up the mess, which was a good thing, but they ended up making lots of money, and people who didn't get those contracts weren't so happy about it. Again, this is just the 1980s, and I'm just hitting some of the high points here. So the first couple of decades of my life in Alaska, holy cow. Things were going at a very quick speed, and by the time we hit the 1990s, you know, there were all kinds of new challenges. We realized that we needed something like the Constitutional Budget Reserve to even out oil prices and be able to pay for things. Oil was declining in production. Remember, no decline after 99. That was the oil industry's tagline. No decline after 99, they promised. Well, of course, couldn't live up to that, given the way oil fields work and international prices. And one other thing about the 1990s, and then I'll not talk about the 2000s because it's too much, but 1990s, another really important decision by the federal government that decade that most people don't even think about was Department of Interior, Ada Deer, head of Indian programs, recognized Alaska's tribes as federally recognized tribes. I don't think most Alaskans even noticed that, or if they noticed it, they didn't really appreciate the impact that would have. And I'm not just talking about government to government and, you know, what we think about in terms of sovereignty issues. I'm talking about the way that opened the door to a lot of federal funding to tribes to this day that enable things to happen in rural Alaska, well, not just rural Alaska, urban Alaska too, that hadn't been funded before, a whole other source of funding and control. And some might argue confusion at the local government level, because you've got cities, you've got tribes, you've got village corporations, you've got regional corporations, you've got the state, you've got the Fed. I mean, there are a lot of ways, and probably many ways, that we could talk about that impact, but another one of those. Anyway, I've gone on way too long. So let's just say it's been a very interesting time to be in Alaska policy and politics. And I feel grateful that I've been here for that whirlwind ride.
Absolutely. Well, you've given us a nice sampler of many of the topics which we'll talk about here over the next 30 to 45 minutes. And I'm struck even when, when you're reflecting on the Exxon Valdez and the damage that caused, even in that darkest moment, even when it was so clear that this oil delivery system that we had set up had failed with the Exxon Valdez, the oil industry was still clearly the dominant force in the state, right? Still clearly the dominant force in the economy, helping to bring back the economy in the late 1980s. I also reflect on the move towards a more sustainable economy, and renewable resources is not a new advent in our economy, right? And to think about Governor Jay Hammond and all of his endeavors, as you just mentioned, I also think about the attempt to build hydropower in the state and the 4-dam pool system that was set up at Bradley Lake. And I think some of the numbers that I've seen is still to this day, every year that displaces something like 20 million gallons of diesel. So as much as there are projects like Delta Barley that were not as successful as we wanted them to be, we had other projects that were quite successful for that moment. Thinking about resource development. So much has changed in this state since the 1970s, politics, demographics. But one thing that has not changed is so many of these resource development battles that we have in the state. And so I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about some of those battles. You've whether it's fisheries, whether it's timber harvest, oil and gas development, what are some of the ways that Alaska has handled resource development well or poorly?
Well, I think the state of Alaska, as you know, had fisheries as a really big impetus in terms of why it became a state. Right, the concern that the federal government was doing a terrible job of managing, particularly the salmon fishery, for the canners and the folks from Seattle, not for Alaskans. So our orientation toward trying to get control of and do a better job at resource management goes all the way back to territorial days and the whole movement to statehood. And I know that in this room, there are a lot of people who have spent a lot of time who have not only thought about it, studied it, but written about it. So I'm not going to go into depth, but let's just say that the Alaska Constitution reflects that fundamental dissatisfaction with the way the federal government was managing resources and the desire to have a sustained yield, common use clause. I mean, there are a number of things in Article 8 that speak directly to natural resource management, reflecting the desire to have management of the resources in a way that would be sustainable, as opposed to simply take as much as you can and be on your way. So the fisheries management system in Alaska is often held up internationally even as a great example of how to do it right. Now, there are lots of ways in which you can either say why that's true or why it's untrue. But in comparison to a lot of other state and even federal management systems, Alaska has done a pretty good job in comparison to many others and in comparison to what once was. So particularly in the fisheries arena, for 10 years, I served on something called the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission, which is the international body that is responsible for making sure that there is no offshore harvest of salmon stocks beyond the 200-mile limit. And in comparison to what Canada was doing, what the state of Washington, Oregon, California were doing, in comparison to what Japan was doing, in comparison to what Russia was doing, I'd have to say Alaska gets an A. But having said that, we know that climate change, we know that bycatch, we know that, intercept fisheries, we know that these issues are still on the table today. And it is really, really hard to manage, particularly stocks like salmon, anadromous fish, like pollock, that spend a great deal of time in the North Pacific Ocean, not within our jurisdiction. So there's a limit to what we can and cannot control. And harvesting these species, there's so many different year groups, so many different seasons, so many different ways in which other actions, including onshore actions in terms of stream management, it's hydroelectric projects. This is complex work, just looking at fisheries. And back when I was in the legislature, I created something called the Fish Caucus, and then I chaired the Fish Caucus. And my fellow legislators came to me, my friends came to me and said, Fran, do you have any idea what you're doing? This is going to be a gigantic headache. Are you sure you want to do this? And I just felt, I was representing Juneau. I had a fish constituency. I had Southeast. I had, I found it fascinating, the intersection of science and policy and economics and the way in which it impacted families and communities. I couldn't resist, but it probably wasn't my smartest political move. Because, by the time I was running for governor, we had a whole bunch of other layers of issues. We had what the federal government had done, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the Americanization of the fisheries, the 200-mile limit. Of course, limited entry had been in place since the early 70s. That was more of a given, but then along came individual fishing quotas for halibut, IFQs, CDQs, community development quotas that the federal government did, and the way in which that sliced up the pie. Am I confusing people with these things? Let me just say, fisheries management in Alaska is a complicated world. And because of the federal jurisdiction and the state jurisdiction, because of the way allocation happens, would I still give Alaska an A? Well, maybe more of a B minus. But again, it compared to what? Compared to what was during territorial days, fabulous. Right. In comparison to a lot of other jurisdictions, really damn good. In comparison to what people wish for in terms of sustainability, maybe not, but climate change has thrown a gigantic curveball into whatever systems the fisheries scientists, the oceanographers, the gear groups, the local fishermen can make sense of and predict. Right now, we are in a period of rapid change in terms of the oceans, in terms of temperature, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of the complexity of the interacting systems. It may be beyond what humans right now can actually manage as wisely as we would like. Let's leave it at that. And that's just fish. I know there were other projects, there were other resources, but I thought we'd just go into one a little more deeply.
Well, fish is so important, and it reminds me too that no matter how well we steward these renewable resources, it's these are not issues that are won or lost, right? This is an enduring fight, in a rapidly changing world. as you mentioned.
And because we're in competition with other countries, you know, there's the influence of Russia dumping fish and what that does to the market. I mean, the last 2 days I was in Anchorage for a National Academy of Sciences panel, a workshop that was being done that compared the Exxon Valdez oil spill with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And what has happened since then and what the recoveries were like. And anyway, it was a deep dive for 2 days into that space and fish came up. Why? Because the folks who were up for this workshop from the Gulf of Mexico were concerned about, excuse me, the collapse of the shrimp industry right now in America because of international shrimp prices. You know, so not because of an oil spill, but I mean, all of, in addition to everything else, the international influence of pricing and what other countries are doing. Let's take salmon farming, for example, and what that has done in terms of destabilizing some of our salmon markets. So there's also that international influence, which makes these resource questions even more complicated.
Absolutely. So I want to put you on the spot here quickly, since we're talking about fish politics, and we have another influential politician at this moment using fish as a major campaign theme, which is Mary Peltola. So you've reflected that perhaps focusing on fish was not the most strategic decision, or certainly not the easiest decision back in the day. What do you think about Mary Peltola's focus on fish politics?
Well, good news, bad news here. Good news is you put up a salmon and most Alaskans feel warm and fuzzy. You know,
Yeah.
we like to eat them, we like to catch them, we support our neighbors who do it. So you see the salmon and you say, yeah, that's Alaska. You know, it's okay, it feels good. You dig deeper into the allocation fights, the price fluctuations, the challenges of permits disappearing and going outside. You know, when you get down to that next level, or when you get down to the level of, oh, let's say attending the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council meeting, where there's a fight between how much more pollock are we going to allow the pollock industry to take versus salmon intercepted headed toward the Yukon River. You know, that's when things get really awkward. So the good news is people feel good about salmon and relate to it as an Alaska value. The bad news is it doesn't take very long before you're in a food fight.
Thanks for letting me to digress from history to politics for a moment. But let's go back to one of my favorite topics. What I think many have argued is the single most intelligent decision in Alaska's history as a state, which is the creation of the Permanent Fund. So you had the good fortune of serving as under Governor Hammond and helping him develop policy, as David talked about, as the head of his policy shop. And one of those very wise policy decisions you had an influence on was the creation of the Permanent Fund in 1976. And I think this is really notable because for the last few years, Alaska has earned more money from the Permanent Fund than we've earned from oil and gas. We are now more of an endowment state than we are an oil and gas state. And yet most Alaskans don't seem to understand it, right? They don't seem to have a full appreciation for what the Permanent Fund has not only provided us in the past, but continues to provide for each year. So while there was great disagreement about the purpose of the Permanent Fund when it was created, you know, how would the money be invested? So many different fights that Dave Rose talks about in his wonderful book. There was a general consensus that this was money that was going to be set aside for when the oil and gas resources of Alaska were declining. So has the Permanent Fund achieved its purpose?
Yes. Should I elaborate?
I would love for you to.
So I'm going to take you back to the mid-70s. I know this will be hard for you all to believe this, but in the mid-70s, the Prudhoe Bay oil field was expected to last for about 25 years. Full stop, period. There was no, all of these other fields will be discovered, slant oil drilling technology will happen, we'll re-inject gas, we'll get more oil out of the assumption was Prudhoe Bay was the biggest, to this day, single oil field ever discovered in North America. It was a limited life field. When it was gone, it was going to be gone. And so the idea was take 25% of bonuses, leases, and royalties, put it in a fund so that when Prudhoe Bay ran out of oil, which it was going to do, back in the mid-70s, it was going to stop. We will have some money for the next generation out of this phenomenal gift that Mother Nature has given us. So there really wasn't that much dispute about it. I mean, that was the mindset. People have forgotten that. And of course, over time, other fields were discovered, other technology was developed, other fields were developed. I mean, obviously, we're long past those days and we still have oil being pumped and it's still contributing, but yeah, thank God. So that was a piece of it. Another piece of it from the J. Hammond perspective was take some of the money off the table. There's just going to be too much money, and boy, there was, even with the permanent fund taking a 25% share of some of the revenues. You still had the tax revenue, you still had a whole bunch of money. It was take some of that off the table because it's going to get wasted. We just can't swallow that much wisely without overheating the economy. Actually, Jay created something called the Growth Policy Council. Some of you may remember that. Dick Fisher served on it, Lydia Selcraig served on it, Lowell Thomas served on it. The whole point of that was how do we slow down the fast growth we're going to get after oil starts flowing down the pipeline in 1977. So yes, the original purpose, take some of the money off the table and save some for future generations. We call this intergenerational equity. I mean, one generation shouldn't get all that wealth that had accumulated, frankly, for millions and millions of years, because that's what it takes to develop oil. But, you know, obviously this leads very quickly into the question of what about the dividend? And Jay also had this vision that, well, gee, you know, a lot of governmental agencies, a lot of businesses, construction companies are going to make out like bandits. So what about the little guy? So he came up with the Alaska Inc. concept. Alaska Inc. was the original dividend program. And that was, got one share for every year you lived in Alaska. So if you lived here 40 years, you had 40 shares. If you lived here 1 year, you got one share, and that would be how much money you would get. And it was Jay Hammond's idea of a way of sort of recognizing all the troubles that the early settlers, the Alaska natives that you know had lived here for years, deprived of necessary infrastructure and social programs and education programs, would be sort of a back payment for that. So Ron Zobel didn't like that idea. He took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, no way, Jose, you can't differentiate based on length of time. One person, one dividend, that's it. So it got changed in 1981. It became the dividend program that we have today. The statute that was created is still the statute, and we've had lots of fights over whether or not that statute should be changed because times were quite a bit different. In 1981, there was so much money we didn't know what to do with. That's quite a bit different than the world we live in now. But I would have to say one more thing about that, and that is that the fight that was taking place at the time that you referenced on the late 70s after it was adopted, just happened to find the 1977 report from the House Special Committee on the Permanent Fund. Hugh Malone, Terry Gardner, Clark Greening. What they talk about in this is that the role of the permanent fund is clearly to save money for the future, to provide for essential services, but the question is how to manage it. That was the real fight. There were people who wanted a development bank, turn it into sort of a commercial enterprise. And there were people who said, no, it should be like an endowment, you know, just saving for a rainy day. There's a huge fight over that. And at least at that time, it became more of an endowment. Jay Hammond was adamantly opposed to a development bank. He said, we already have ADA, we don't need another one. But that has changed over time. So Jay's hope was that at some point, when we ran out of money, we'd impose an income tax to balance the books. He talked about that till the day he died, actually, that people ought to contribute. The theme of this conference, of course, rights and responsibilities. From Jay Hammond's perspective, a responsibility is paying an income tax so that you can pay for things. And he wanted to have both the income tax and the permanent fund dividend. That was his vision. That's not everybody's vision, but that was his. So did it succeed? Yes. Did it succeed in the way Jay wanted, in the sense that it would make future generations pay more attention to the quality of management of the fund? I'm not sure you can make that case, because we've seen some recent issues, shall we say, with the management regime and the way the board of the permanent fund is managing. I'm not sure most Alaskans are paying attention to that piece of it. So from that standpoint, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that you could say it has succeeded in making people pay more attention to government, other than just how big is their dividend. I'm not sure you can make that case. So largely yes, with a few caveats of no.
Great.
Sorry for the long answer.
No. So much more that I want to talk about here. This is fantastic. And you're absolutely right. The management was the big fight. What are we going to do with this? I recall that Alaskans traveled to Alberta, which had created the Alberta Heritage Fund in the 1960s to try to learn from them. And they put the money into a development bank and basically squandered it because they spent it on in-state projects that would produce jobs rather than long-term growth, as Alaska did. And then, of course, the other part of this story is that Norway came to Alaska to learn from Alaska on how to set up their fund. And what did they learn? They learned, don't abolish your income tax, keep it in these kind of boring, more or less boring investments. And by the way, have an ownership stake in your oil and gas infrastructure so that you have a seat at the table. This is something that Alaska didn't do. Statoil, that's right. Equinor now they're developing offshore wind. So really fascinating, but I want to reflect just a little bit more on our public perceptions of the permanent fund and the fact that Jay Hammond's vision of people really having a stake and really being focused on what is being done with their money, that obviously that vision has not come to pass. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this disjuncture between the fact that our cultural consciousness seems to be lagging behind economic reality, right? We had showed this slide before about how important the permanent fund is to Alaskans, and yet most Alaskans don't even have a sense of how exactly the permanent fund dividend is calculated as part of the annual permanent fund earnings. And so I'm just wondering, why do we see such a disconnect there? And is there anything that you envision that we could do to make it so that Alaskans are more connected with this intergenerational wealth?
In part, you're hitting on the very topic we'll discuss tomorrow with Richard Haas. The rights and responsibilities of citizens and the general, not just Alaska specific, but maybe US more generally true. People really not even understanding basic civics. I mean, I'm not sure how many schools really teach basic civics anymore, anywhere in our country. And so this notion of what does it mean to be a citizen? What is my responsibility, not just to vote, although certainly that's important, and we know many people don't even vote. But what's my responsibility as a citizen to understand how government works and the decisions that our elected officials are making? And maybe part of it's feeling disengaged and I don't know, maybe it's because politics has become so mean that people kind of turn off to the whole notion of paying attention, because it's just become so negative and so, I don't know, discouraging for many people. I think it's a bigger question than just as it relates to the dividend in Alaska. I think it's more of a general US problem, and it's, I don't know, I'll just sidebar conversation with people as I've traveled internationally. I was in New Zealand and Australia in January and Chile and Argentina in March. And, you know, people ask me, why are Americans so angry? I can't answer that question, but it has something fundamental to do with their sense of loss of control over the world they live in, over the decisions that get made, and how much of that is our own fault. Wow, this has gotten way more philosophical. Oh, we're supposed to talk about Alaska history here, but what you ask is a really big question, and it's bigger than Alaska, but you know, more Alaska specific, I will say, well, let's look at the demographics for just a moment. In 1970, the population of Alaska was around 300,000, and now it's more than double that, 730,000. Not a lot, but double. The population of Anchorage in 1970 was 48,000, and now it's 290,000. So Anchorage is 6 times as big as it was. And a lot of people in Alaska come and go a lot. I mean, think about our workforce: military, oil and gas, mining, a little bit of timber, federal employees. People are here for 3 or 4 years and they're gone. So what happens when you get a high percentage of your population turning over that frequently? You don't have the sense of connectedness that many of the people in this room have. Many of the people in this room, even people who have come here relatively recently, but you're at a historical society meeting. I mean, that speaks for itself. You feel connected tissue. And needless to say, Alaska Native people have a deep, thousands of years long connective tissue to this place. But there are a lot of people who just, this is a temporary stop. So does that make it more likely that they pay less attention to their government and more attention to just how big the dividend is? Probably.
Yep.
I think there are a number of things about who we are as a state, what our economy is like, the turnover that contribute to why it's maybe more of a problem for us. And I've certainly heard people make the argument, and to a certain extent, I agree with it, that the fact that no one pays taxes here also contributes to the lack of attention, frankly, because it's all free.
Yep. Yep.
I know some of you pay property taxes. And I know some of you live in a community that actually has a sales tax. So there's that. But generally, you know, not to have a statewide tax of any kind, sales or income, has definitely contributed to losing that connective tissue between paying attention to public policy decisions and your own pocketbook.
Absolutely, and that's why Jay Hammond wanted to keep the income tax as part of that equation with the dividend, to have people more connected, as you just mentioned. But I think that answer also speaks to the next question that I want to ask, which is about our collective memory. And we had a wonderful Alaska Historical Society lecture series. And in that, Charles Woolforth argued that Alaskans no longer have a coherent narrative stitching our history together. And I suppose this assumes that there was a moment in time when we did have a narrative, right? Certainly there was a settler narrative or a pioneer narrative, but that also presumes that that was a narrative that was shared by all of Alaska's population, right? And I'm just really wondering how the question remains about how we Alaskans understand ourselves as a polity, as a society, even as a civilization, especially in regard to the shared, complicated, and at times predatory relationship between settler populations and Alaska Natives. So do you think, what do you see as the big picture narrative of Alaska's history? And what elements of our history do you think are essential for us to remember?
Well, that's that's worth more than an off-the-cuff response, I think. But let me say a few things. First of all, I do agree with him. I do think that our sense of who we are as a state has become kind of I don't know, disjointed, maybe. I think there are places in the state of Alaska where there's still a coherent narrative based on the history of that specific community or that specific region or that specific economy, the fishing community in Bristol Bay, et cetera. Certainly among the Alaska Native people, and I would not presume to speak for them, but I have paid a lot of attention and been tutored by many of them. And I think the people like Willie Hensley and Byron Millett and others would say, well, there isn't just one Alaska Native narrative either. There may be certainly common themes about the importance of family and culture and maintaining traditions and languages and passing on to the next generation. So there is that probably across the board with the Alaska Native people and their culture, but it's quite different. I mean, I'm an adopted Tlingit. I know more about the Tlingit's cultural traditions than I know about the other Alaska Native traditions. But I will just say that, you know, when I'm in Yupik territory, I know that Tlingit culture does not apply. And, you know, so we're pretty regionalized. Maybe always have been, probably always will be. Directly relevant to your question of whether we've ever had a more cohesive narrative than we have right now, I think the statehood movement, I think that era probably had a more cohesive movement. And, you know, I've been going through these old files lately to try to get rid of files. Anybody else going through this? So I ran across Alaska Visionaries. Karen Purdue, you will probably remember this. This is the 50th anniversary of statehood. There were a series of events and this booklet and many other booklets that were written at the time, kind of reflecting on statehood. And one of the things that I happened to be reading yesterday on the plane coming down here is relevant to your question. It talks about Ernest Greening, who declared that the movement to create a state was to end American colonialism. And he laid out what he meant by colonialism. A geographic area held for political, strategic, and economic advantage. Advantage by either or both the federal government and absentee corporate interests for political, strategic, and especially economic advantage. So I would say the cohesive narrative at that time, even though not everybody supported it. I mean, Jay Hammond didn't support statehood at first. But the movement was to kind of take control of who we are And again, what that actually meant vis-a-vis the thousands of years of tradition and occupation and utilization and management by Alaska Native people. I mean, that was segregated in the statehood movement quite a bit. It was not front and center. It is today, but it wasn't then. But it was this notion of we want to be in control instead of the salmon packers from Seattle or instead of Washington, D.C. So I think that was a cohesive narrative. And I think that narrative, to a certain extent, you mentioned that Richard Feinberg had passed away and that you were working on some remarks regarding his contribution. You know, there have been movements, particularly against corporate interests, whether that was the oil industry or whether that was whomever. There have been movements, and there still are today, about rejecting the federal government's influence. Even though the federal government last year was the major contributor to our general fund and to building things in the state and for keeping healthcare alive, et cetera, we still love to hate the federal government. So there are elements of that notion of sort of that, the 1950s version of colonialism, but that is not the predominant, I wouldn't say, the predominant narrative. The predominant narrative probably still relates to that salmon I talked about. You know, that we have natural resources, that we appreciate them, we utilize them, we want them to be around for future generations. I think that's still a part of our narrative. I think individual and privacy rights are still a part of our narrative. I'd like to believe that embracing diversity is more of our narrative today than it was during the statehood era. I mean, I have seen just in the time that I have lived here, the extraordinary explosion of appreciation for Alaska Native culture, for the role that Alaska Native corporations are playing in our economy, the way in which that has contributed to not only vibrancy, but economic viability of regions. I would like to believe that that is a generally held impression, but I can't really say that for sure. Not an adequate answer to your question, but that's the best I can do.
I'm not sure there's a single answer to that question, but that's, I think, part of the project of this conference as well, is to begin conversations about that. And I know Charles is continuing to work on that question as well. But I'm so glad that you brought up the Ada Deer decision in 1993 and that, you know, really monumental decision to recognize Alaskan tribes, underappreciated at the time. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the weight of that decision on Alaska. And so often, you know, in history textbooks and perhaps even in high school history classes, there's this notion that ANCSA in 1971 somehow settled these major questions about indigenous land claims and subsistence, and obviously subsistence was taken up again in ANILCA. But you know, how is the ongoing fight for tribal and subsistence rights? How has that created both new opportunities but also new challenges for Alaska Native peoples?
Yeah, that's a big one. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act did resolve land claims. And the tribal recognition done by Ada Deer in the Department of Interior in the 90s does not change that. It sets in motion a different system of decision-making and authority, which doesn't directly compete with, but indirectly competes with the structure that was created by ANCSA. And it's really beyond my ability this morning to cleanly state all of the ways in which that both is a positive and a negative. But I'm sure there are a couple of people who are expert in that in this room that will probably at one of the panels over the next 2 days talk more about it. at its surface, at least, it created the opportunity for more money. More money flowing to Alaska Native people and to regions through the tribal system. It also empowered people who in the Alaska Native community perhaps had not been empowered in their village corporate structure or their regional corporate structure. It empowered them in a different kind of way for decision-making within their tribe and within their region, which probably contributed to a sense of efficacy, which generally speaking in social science studies tends to equate with happiness. I'm not sure that it does, but that's what the studies say. That when you feel as though you have some more control over your life, over your family, over your community, over the future, that's that sense of efficacy, and perhaps that has happened in some tribal communities. You're right, it does nothing in terms of the subsistence question, really. It may change the extent to which federal agencies acknowledge and must accept the information provided and the positions taken by tribes on subsistence harvest decisions that get made by federal agencies, because the tribes have government-to-government authority. But without going into a lot of legal language, let's just say that it isn't all that clear how it changes the federal resource management regime. That whole arena is being revisited by AFN right now, actually. AFN has undertaken, under the new leadership of Ben Malott, as Julie has passed the gavel, an effort to revisit the whole subsistence question, our efforts to get a constitutional amendment, to get clarity, and how that might be layered with the tribal recognition. I'm not smart enough to answer that part of the question, and I don't know who will, but over the next 5 or 6 years, I think you'll hear more about that. And for those of you who care a lot about that issue, I would encourage you to engage on that topic, because I think there's some policy vacuums that could be filled and hopefully will be filled with thoughtful balancing of the realities of Alaska with the desires of people to have more control. You know, should we explain any of these slides? I've been sitting up here for a while now. Obviously, Tony Knowles, Susan Knowles, and I did a Yukon River trip. That was during the era of before the Katie John decision, or maybe right after the Katie John decision. You see Frank grew up there, who used to head Fish and Game and others. Yeah, so Tony and I often would go out into the field to try to either understand, get to know local people, but also to generate support for decisions that needed to be made. And sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't. The next slide, whoever's doing the slides. Yeah, well, here I am. I got to sing the Star Spangled Banner at a game, baseball game in Seattle, when Governor Wally Hickel threw the first ball of the season in a Governor's game. Yeah, and if you've ever sung the national anthem, and I hope you all have at one time or another, doing it with a mic in the hand in a baseball stadium is not ideal. Only did that once. Fishing, the fishing actually was the day I took Ann Richards fishing. So let's move on to, I don't know, there's Ann Richards, governor of Texas, back when Texas was Democratic. So every time a woman of any note came to Alaska who wanted to go fishing, I got to take them fishing. And so, yeah, that was a picture of our fishing on the Yukon River. Obviously, President and his wife came to town. They came to Alaska a number of times. Actually, Bill Clinton enjoyed coming to Alaska. They did not go fishing with me. Should have, but he made many visits, and actually it was a lovely period because Tony and I had the door open to the White House, and we had a lot of opportunities to actually influence policy at that time, which is always kind of fun. Okay, next slide. Oh, yes, so occasionally people get invited to fly in an F-15 fighter jet. And when I was lieutenant governor, I got the call because Tony Knowles did not want to do it. So, and as you may know, when you're lieutenant governor, you get to do things that you want to do, and you also get to do things that the governor doesn't want to do. And this was one of them that I really very much enjoyed, when General Tom Case called and said, okay, Fran, do you want to do this? I said, sure. I had no idea what I was getting into. We had to actually go get trained because they don't want you to go up there and die. And they fit you with this special suit. Those are pressurized pants. So when you go up in F-15, they are pumping air pressure around your legs so you don't pass out. I know this sounds weird, but that's what happened. So it was a fairly big deal, but boy, was it fun. You feel like you're a bird flying in one of those. And no, I did not pass out.
And then
That's my family. My late husband, Bill Council, and my kids, Louis and Amelia, and she lives in New Orleans, and it was really funny. Both my son and my daughter went off to North Carolina, went to Davidson College. My daughter stayed in the South. My son could not wait to get back. He works for First National Bank Alaska, lives in Anchorage. Yeah, next slide.
maybe there was one earlier that we.
Oh, yeah, you missed, well, Mayor Juneau, yeah, that was my first elected office. Local government is where it's at. I mean, if my kids refuse to go grocery shopping with me. Because it would take like an hour to get out of the grocery store. When you're serving at the local government level, and I'm sure there are some local government people here who can relate to it, people want to talk about snow removal and garbage collection, and all of those things that really impact their lives. It was a great place to start. I actually love being there, but my kids not so much. Okay, next. There was the, oh yeah, Jay. Yeah, so VIPs would come visit the governor, of course, and that's Bill Gordon from Fairbanks, who also worked for the governor at the time. That actually is me. I know it doesn't look like me at all, but there was a long hair period, yeah, and of course Terry Grant. Yeah, there was one other, and I think it was the signing of the permanent fund. Doesn't really matter. It was Steve Cooper. Yeah, there we go. Steve Cooper. Yeah, actually, I'm not sure what was that. That may have been the Alaska Science and Technology Foundation legislation that Steve promoted. You know, Steve Cooper promoted an education endowment, a constitutional amendment. It failed the Senate by one vote, which was really a tragedy. It was in the late 1980s, and I've often thought about what a difference it would have made had that education endowment passed. It's one of the real regrets I have about the 1980s that didn't pass. Finally, in 2018, the percent of market value legislation passed, which set in motion the authorization for a portion of the permanent fund earnings to actually be used for revenues. But I think Steve's idea was a great one, and I'm sorry that didn't happen. But anyway, we almost run out of time.
Yeah,
I've
well-
been talking forever. You guys must be so bored. Oh.
I had one more question about the Arctic, but I think we should open it up to the audience and see what questions the audience have. And because of the Zoom situation, if folks just ask a question, I'll repeat it, and then the Zoom folks will be able to hear it.
Anybody have any questions?
Go for it.
Oh,
Go for it.
Okay, I'll be hands, and hope you can read something. You know, we had a woman in Fairbanks in the 20s who was what we call a bag lady, and when she died, she had $1 million. And I feel like we're in that state with Alaska. We have a lot of money saved. We are living off our savings, I understand that, but we have an energy problem that is really killing us, especially in, we're all over the state. I don't know, Fran, if you have any thoughts on, you know, big structural things that we can do, to address, the loss of our gas supply and this whole lack of instability that we have right now with the amount of resources that we actually do have.
So the question is, what could we be doing right now? If Fran has any big picture insights into what we might do to redress issues like the gas supply and other structural things that are causing volatility, especially in energy supply.
So back in the late 80s and 90s, we spent some money on building hydroelectric projects and a big intertie that links South Central. And rural Alaska felt left out. And so the power cost equalization program was adopted and has been funded pretty generously ever since. And the PCE, power cost equalization, basically is an electricity subsidy for rural Alaska, which was sort of to compensate for the amount of money that the state put into building these hydroelectric projects in South Central and the intertie, and perhaps one would argue artificially reducing the cost of energy for some, but not for others. So that was the structural adaptation, Karen, when there was an effort to kind of first recognize that the electricity costs were high. Secondly, recognize that as long as electricity costs are high, it's going to have a drag on economic development as well as just what citizens can afford, right? So you're asking the question, where are we now and what should we be doing to address that problem? And of course, I live in Anchorage now, where there's a really big problem because we're running out of natural gas and we haven't really forward funded with any kind of a funding mechanism to kind of buy down the cost of natural gas. And Fairbanks always has a problem, right? But let's, should we be honest here? The way Alaskans live, scattered over a state that's 1/5 the size of the United States, you can fit 18 New York states into the state of Alaska. I mean, we are humongous and we are spread out all over the place. And every town, whether you're 200, 2,000 or 200,000, feels as though they ought to have cheap electricity and a new performing arts center and water and sanitation. This is tough love, folks. This is so unrealistic given our population. So yeah, we have oil and gas, but that's not good enough. It's the transmission, it's the development, it's the last mile. Those things cost, and somebody's got to pay for it. So just having the resource, that's just a small piece of what it actually costs to deliver in a state like ours, where you have this very distributed population. We don't have economies of scale. So yeah, things cost a lot because frankly, they cost a lot to deliver to people living the way we have chosen to live. This really hurts to say out loud, but it needs to be said. I was at a meeting in Washington, D.C. last spring. I still am associated with Harvard at the Kennedy School where we do work on Arctic things. And we were talking about the many, many communities in the Arctic that may have to move because of coastal erosion, permafrost thaw, just deteriorating infrastructure, and the fact that climate change, it's like writing on a wall. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is located and identified over 30 villages that are at serious risk of not existing 10 years from now, even with new seawalls. And And we don't really have a way to relocate people to be affordable. I mean, every village would cost millions and millions and millions of dollars to relocate. And this isn't just an Alaska problem. I mean, almost a quarter of the northern hemisphere is underlain with permafrost, either continuous or discontinuous. Permafrost is thawing. I'm here to tell you folks, major infrastructure, whether it's the pipeline in Alaska or the oil industry in northern Russia, which is where most of their oil is, it's in the Arctic. That major infrastructure, as well as villages, are at serious risk. The world 10 years from now, particularly the Arctic, isn't going to look anything like it looks today. And at this conference I was at, back at Harvard, there were a number of people in attendance who had heard this sort of for the first time. And they said, well, all these little villages, you've got them all over the place. I mean, they can't all move, can they? Who's going to pay for it? So there is no answer to that question. Nobody wants to pay for that. Nobody can pay for that because, oh, by the way, Silicon Valley is going to be underwater as well, and Boston, and New York City, and New Orleans, and a whole lot of other places by the end of the century, unless things change dramatically. That's the course we're in. Miami Beach. I can't believe that people are still investing in Miami Beach. It's on limestone, for pity's sakes. You could build a wall around it. All you're going to have is a bathtub because it's going to come up from underneath. I mean, we are being so unrealistic about what's happening here. So you can talk about the price of electricity, Karen, and it's of course a concern, but in a way, it's almost yesterday's concern. Tomorrow's concern is a heck of a lot bigger than the price you're paying for electricity in Fairbanks or Anchorage or any place else in Alaska. And as a society, and I'm not just talking about Alaska right now, I'm talking about human populations around the world are really having a hard time facing those realities. How did I get onto this? I'm so sorry. Karen, I really apologize. That isn't where I was going to go with this, but I just thought it was time for a little Arctic therapy here. Things are really in deep doo-doo.
We had a question back there first, and then over here. Yes, sir.
You have a new perspective for this question, serving both in Juneau and Anchorage. What do you see the future is for the capital movement?
The question is, what is the future of capital?
Yeah, well, that's pretty funny. As you will remember, the last vote on the capital move was, do you want to pay for it? And that was defeated, and it's never come back. Because of course, at the time, the capital move idea was build a Brasilia, basically, in Willow, which would have cost a lot of money. And people did not want that. So if you put something on the ballot that had a different question, would it pass? Maybe. There are a lot of people in Alaska who have never been to Juneau and have this somewhat crazy idea that they'd actually go to the legislative hearing. I mean, when I've been asked by people in the lower 48, isn't it kind of weird that you can't drive to your capital? And I say, when was the last time you drove to your capital? When was the last time you actually went to a legislative meeting, even though it was like 5 blocks away? And that, of course, telecommunications has changed the world, and now we Zoom meetings all over the place. So yeah, I don't think that's happening.
Other questions? Yeah. So that's, and then we'll go Rachel. Yeah.
Yeah, your discussion before, global warming and sustainability and whatnot, kind of we've been there. Is there any vision that we might have as Alaskans to kind of help take the lead in having a sustainable, renewable, climate change resistant economy?
The question is, what can Alaska do to take the lead in a renewable, sustainable climate change economy?
I love these easy questions. So there are kind of like three parts to that answer that I will give you. So one part is, what is our responsibility to the big picture worldwide climate change problem? One part of it is, what can we do as Alaskans in Alaska to be more sustainable in terms of our energy uses? And the third part of it is, what part of our economy can actually be sustainable after oil, or as oil continues to decline? So those are three different things, all of which are worth talking about. But in the time we have left, I'll try to be brief. With regard to the worldwide problem that we face, you could shut down Prudhoe Bay tomorrow and it wouldn't solve the problem, right? So for people who are really hard over on the question of, well, how can you still be an oil producing state if you got this, the most dramatic climate change impacts, and, you ought to just shut it down? I say, well, it's going to come from somewhere. As long as people are still heating their homes with fuel oil or driving their cars with gasoline. So yeah, maybe it'll come from Russia instead of coming from Alaska, but that doesn't really solve the problem. I mean, there's a whole debate about that, but that's my opinion. So our role really is more of an advocate for the policy changes and the investments that need to be made to change our worldwide economy, one piece at a time, to be more sustainable and to use the kinds of resources that do not burn fossil fuels. So that brings us to the second thing. What can Alaska be doing to be more? We do have tidal energy, we do have geothermal energy, we have solar energy, we have wind energy. We have made progress. REAP has done a lot of really good work in our state to educate people about how affordable alternative energy is. I mean, at the individual level and at the community level and at the state level, moving in that direction more and more and faster, and having political support for the investments in the in the renewable energy arena, as opposed to simply saying, well, so what if I'm burning fossil fuels in Fairbanks, right? And then there's the economy piece. Well, we've tried a lot of things. We've tried Delta barley, we've tried hatcheries. Tourism is big. You can define that as a renewable industry, or there are some people who would say it's also an extractive industry because the way it impacts communities. That's a more complicated conversation. But obviously there are other opportunities, and geothermal hydrogen, and I mean, there are things that within the realm of technological possibilities we could be a leader in instead of a follower in, that would help both our energy consumption and our portfolio of economic opportunities. So I wouldn't give up on those things. I do think fisheries remains a mainstay in our state, and hopefully will be, because it keeps not just the commercial and the sport fishing, but also tourism, and most importantly, subsistence as a core thing. So I would say continuing to pay attention on those aspects of our economy that maybe aren't going to ever be like oil is, but that are important players in a balanced economy. As oil continues to diminish, there are other opportunities.
And fundamentally, I would say in terms of energy, we've got to electrify everything and decarbonize electricity supply. That's the core, really, what we've got to do. I think we have time for one more question. Rachel, if you want to jump in.
Okay, yeah, you mentioned that there's a lot of people in Alaska who hate the federal government. And I worked for both the state subsistence program and also the federal subsistence program in the 1990s, and encountered a lot of people who were still mad at Jimmy Carter for signing an ILCA and so forth. But from the point of view of Native communities, there was an idea that the feds were better for management of subsistence than the state had been. And there was a lot of hostility in those days in meetings and so forth. And I wonder if you could just comment on whether there has been better rapprochement between the state and the feds on subsistence issues and other issues, given that there is such a dependence on federal income.
So the question is about the relationship between the state and the federal government over subsistence issues.
It kind of waxes and wanes based on the leadership in both federal agencies and state governments. So you get leaning either in toward, let's work together, or leaning outward and gee, let's just litigate the heck out of it. So there hasn't been one consistent course, I would say, on that relationship, and whether it was, I mean, it's almost like you could have a continuum from really bad to really good, and the relationship between the state and federal government, specifically on resource management, whether it's subsistence resource management or others, has slid back and forth on that between really terrible to really as good as it can be to, you know, so it's all over the map. How it is right now, you know, I'm not intimately in that space. I don't follow it as closely as I used to, so I can't give it a grade. But my impression is that yes, there is a sense in the Alaska Native community that the federal government is far more supportive of subsistence than the state government is. That's my perception. I, again, won't speak on their behalf, but that's my perception. And I think it is because the Biden administration has taken a very forward-leaning approach toward indigenous rights, toward respecting sovereignty, toward empowering tribal governments, toward, I mean, you know, it, at any rate. And rather on the other side, in terms of state government, that they have not felt as supported by this administration. So where does that end up in terms of ever resolving the difference that has evolved over time? I think that's why the Alaska Federation of Natives right now is looking at the subsistence question again, looking at the constitutional amendment that the Knowles Ulmer administration tried to push through the legislature years and years ago. And looking at, well, depending upon how the election in November turns out in terms of each president, how that might shift also that balance between state and federal management regimes. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how that's going to unfold. But for those of you who follow that issue, as I said, you could probably answer that question better than I could.
All right, folks, we're at time. Big round of applause for And just one quick announcement too, for the next two sessions. The first one is going to be here on this floor just across the hallway, and the second one of which is upstairs. So those are two of the primary conference rooms that we're using. And we have a break right now. Enjoy the goodies, and look forward to seeing you all in the conference.
Yeah. That was so good.